significance of Lonergan's OU method in theology. I'd like to begin by acknowledging someone who's not here this evening, which is Ligida Rilschkite, our now colleague as a visiting assistant professor in the theology department, whose idea of the series was an event like this, as you may imagine, doesn't just pull itself together. And but it can seem amazingly effortless for a person like myself, thanks to very hard work by Mary, the assistant director of the Lonergan Institute, and a tireless and seemingly innumerable army of student volunteers and conscripts who make everything happen very smoothly. So I'm grateful to all of them, and also to, in addition to the aforementioned, to Pat Byrne and Carrie Cronin and other members of our community for helping plan these events, think through who the speakers should be and what kinds of topics would be fitting. This is the first event that's occurring during my tenure as director of the Lonergan Institute, and I'm really grateful that it's really an event that was already sorted out, so that I could have such a good event as my first event. On that note, I'm delighted to welcome our guest of honor this evening, Professor Nikolaus Wandinger, a native of Bavaria, but a resident of Austrian Tyrol. Professor Wandinger has been for many years now professor in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Innsbruck, where he is currently head of the Department of Systematic Theology. He is a recognized expert on the thought of Raymond Schwager and René Girard, and he has edited or co-edited 3 critical editions of Schwager's work, including Schwager's correspondence with René Girard. A former editor of the Bulletin of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, COVR, which is basically how the Girard Society masquerades. He is currently that body's executive secretary. His research interests include sin as a basic concept for Christian anthropology. I'm executing the practicum. He has also published a German book on this topic in Karl Rahner and Raymond Schwager, and in dramatic theology as a theological research program. He also participates in a collaboration of his faculty theologically examining social problems like mimesis and rivalry, violence, and ostracism. Professor Wandinger's numerous articles have appeared in German and English in both European and North American journals. His title this evening is Religious Conversion as an Ongoing Process. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy, for this wonderful introduction. Before I start, I want to thank several people that made this possible, that invited me here. Pat Byrne, then Fred Lawrence, who was the first to bring me to Boston to a Lonergan workshop many years ago. Then, of course, Jeremy, who introduced me, and Ligida Rilschkite. I just tried to hear how to pronounce her name, but I couldn't even remember it this short while, so I'm sorry if you're listening in. Thank you for inviting me and having me. And before I start, also one preliminary remark. I quote my important authors quite at length because I think that they are best to express their thoughts. But still, I had to shorten some of the quotation for today because we don't want to be here all night. And therefore, I made this little quotation sheet that was distributed. Now, in all those paragraphs where you find bold print, I will read out only the bold print. The rest is there for you to have the context. In those paragraphs where there is just normal print, I really read out the whole quotation because I think it is important. So I want to make or offer to you considerations from dramatic theology on religious conversion as a lifelong process. When I was first asked to contribute to the 50th anniversary of Method in Theology, I thought about what I found most intriguing in this seminal book. Many things came to mind, but I must admit what has been intriguing me most in Lonergan's work on theological method was his attempt to clarify the role of the subject. In the humanities, and even more so in theology, it is clear that the subject cannot be passed over. Some use this as an argument for excluding these studies from academic disciplines, as they cannot be objective in the sense required for the sciences. Others defended the humanities being part of academia, but excluded theology from that defense, as it seemed not only subjectivist, but bound to a particular faith tradition and therefore incapable of academic freedom. In the German-speaking countries, there is a special edge to that argument. As in German, the term Wissenschaft is used for the sciences as well as for the humanities. But what about theology? Can it be a Wissenschaft? As there are still theological faculties at state universities in German-speaking countries, and their existence is being questioned every so often, this question is more than academic. It has political reverberations. Here, Lonergan is of invaluable importance when he claims and then substantiates with arguments that, quote, genuine objectivity is the fruit of authentic subjectivity. Hence, for me, this is what makes method unique. Its explicit and thorough treatment of the role of the subject in theology, in full knowledge of the problematic and the possible biases of the subject, and yet arguing clearly that doing theology and actually gaining knowledge in general is impossible except for an authentic subject, even in the sciences, but clearly so in the humanities and in theology. The problem now is not the role of the subject anymore. The problem becomes how to ascertain an authentic subject. The importance of authentic subjectivity. Authentic subjectivity for Lonergan is attained through a threefold conversion: intellectual, moral, and religious. I am specifically concerned here with religious conversion, and will soon attend to it in more detail. But let us first remember what the function of these conversions is within Lonergan's theological method. After theologians have done their research, interpreted their data, ascertained the history, they come up with different horizons, thereby completing the first mediating phase of theological method. Lonergan distinguishes different types of differences between horizons, but the type he's interested in most is dialectically opposed horizons. About those, he says, what in one is found intelligible, in another is unintelligible. What for one is true, for another is false. What for one is good, for another is evil. For dialectical differences involve mutual repudiation. End of quote. They cannot be reconciled. They cannot be overcome by terminological differentiations. They necessitate a choice in the theologian about one's horizon, one's outlook, one's worldview. Let us hear now Lonergan explain the role of conversion and of the functional specialty foundations that deals with it. And this is the first series of quotations you find on your quotations sheet. Lonergan says, as conversion is basic to Christian living, so an objectification of conversion provides theology with its foundations. By conversion is understood a transformation of the subject and his world. Normally, it is a prolonged process, though its explicit acknowledgement may be concentrated in a few momentous judgments and decisions. It is as if one's eyes were opened and one's former world faded and fell away. Conversion is existential, intensely personal, utterly intimate, but it is not so private as to be solitary. It can happen to many, and they can form a community to sustain one another in their self-transformation and to help one another in working out the implications and fulfilling the promise of their new life. Finally, what can become communal can become historical. It can pass from generation to generation. It can spread from one cultural milieu to another. It can adapt to changing circumstances, confront new situations, survive into different age, flourish in another period or epoch. Conversion as lived affects all of a man's conscious and intentional operations. He continues, inasmuch as conversion itself is made thematic and explicitly objectified, there emerges the fifth functional specialty, foundations. Foundations present not doctrines, but the horizon within which the meaning of doctrines can be apprehended. In theological reflection, there have to be distinguished the horizons within which religious doctrines can or cannot be apprehended, and this distinction is foundational. We may note that as conversion may be authentic or unauthentic, so there may be many Christian horizons, and not all of them need represent authentic conversion. Further, while it may be possible to conceive authentic conversion in more than one manner, still the number of possible manners would seem to be far fewer than the number of possible horizons. It follows that our foundations contain a promise, both of an elucidation of the conflicts revealed in dialectic, and of a selective principle that will guide the remaining specialties concerned with doctrines, systematics, and communication. End of this long series of quotations. Let us now attend more concretely to the meaning of religious conversion for Wanninger's method. The significance of religious conversion. In the following section of my talk, I first want to indicate a possible misunderstanding that the term conversion might elicit. Then I will illustrate and further develop the significance of religious conversion in Wanninger's sense, as I understand it, by viewing a discussion between Raymond Schwager and René Girard on the meaning of sacrifice through the prism of Wanninger's theology of conversion. This will lead to the question of what the repercussions for the understanding of the sacred might be, where I will make a suggestion to refine the terminology. I will end by emphasizing that this kind of conversion is a lifelong, ongoing process. The possible misunderstanding. In colloquial usage, the term conversion often is used to name a person's change of religious affiliation. Wanninger's methodological usage of the term religious conversion, however, does not necessarily entail such a change and is rather neutral towards any specific religious tradition. And it also allows for the possibility of a religious conversion within one and the same religious tradition. One can have been a lifelong practicing member of a religious community, let's say the Catholic Church, and still not be properly converted. And even the whole community can lack in conversion. Wanninger explains, religious conversion is being grasped by ultimate concern. It is otherworldly falling in love. Religious conversion is interpreted differently in the context of different religious traditions. For Christians, it is God's love flooding our hearts through the Holy Spirit given to us. Religious conversion is to a total being in love as the efficacious ground of all self-transcendence, whether in the pursuit of truth, or in the realization of human values, or in the orientation man adopts to the universe, its ground and its goal. End of quote. It is neutral in that it does not presuppose a specific religion. As Wanninger expressly distinguishes between a general description of what religious conversion consists in, and a specific Christian interpretation, and of course there then might be interpretations also in other religions of conversion. So it would be a misunderstanding to assume that when Wanninger speaks about religious conversion in his method in theology, This is about changing one's religious affiliation. As my theological approach comes from dramatic theology, my interest lies in how Lonergan's analysis and the work of persons important for dramatic theology go together, maybe are complementary and mutually enlightening, or maybe are at odds with each other. The claim that one can be unconverted within a principally converted religion, or that a whole strain of religious tradition can lack in conversion, is one of the phenomena where I think that Lonergan and dramatic theology are mutually enlightening. I have argued and illustrated this already elsewhere, and want to revisit this argument here in a somewhat modified version. Two kinds of sacrifice. The theological school of dramatic theology, to which I belong, was most deeply shaped by Raymond Schwager. Schwager himself was greatly influenced by the French-American cultural anthropologist René Girard and his mimetic theory. What is not so well known is that Schwager, for his part, also influenced Girard and had a significant role in shaping mimetic theory. We learned this when we edited this correspondence the two conducted from 1974 until 1991. One of their arguments can be seen as an argument about special theological categories, and behind that lies, according to Lonergan, the question of religious conversion. I am speaking of what constitutes a sacrifice in a sense that is compatible with Christian religious conversion, with authentic Christian religious conversion. The early works of Girard, that is up until 1993, had a very strong standpoint on sacrifice and claimed its inapplicability to Christ's passion. Girard had developed his concept of sacrifice from analyzing archaic religions and speculating about the beginning of humankind as being grounded in a primordial murder, which later turned into human sacrifice. According to Girard, the institution of sacrifice developed from mimetically induced violence contagiously spreading throughout the human group, thereby endangering the very existence of that group by throwing it into a war of all against all. In a mimetically structured human society, only the scapegoat mechanism can prevent self-destruction because it is itself mimetically structured, yet focuses the dissipating violence on a single victim. If, during the fight of all against all, a particularly successful combatant is observed to fight a person who might be distinguished by certain peculiarities that make him or her somehow different from the others and possibly weaker, mimetic contagion will make the other combatants emulate this strong fighter, and they will convene on the selected weaker victim and collectively kill him or her. The result of this killing will be a sudden and surprising onset of peace. The target of the common aggression has been killed, the aggression subsides. This, however, to the participants is inexplicable unless the killed person had some superhuman power. The power to stabilize the whole society in the first place, driving it to the brink of destruction, and then the power to bring suddenly peace back again. As a consequence, the victim of the discharge of violence is divinized and revered as a god or goddess to whom then later human sacrifices are sacrificed. Girard writes, "The peoples of the world do not invent their gods. They deify their victims." This is basically what Girard calls the scapegoat mechanism. It should be noted that the term scapegoat here is used in the modern sense of the term, meaning a person onto whom his or her society projects their own guilt, accuses them of being guilty, although the person is innocent, or at least not guiltier than all the others, but the people who do that do so unconsciously. Religious cults of human sacrifice, Girard argues, spring from the primordial experience of all-out violence and its inexplicable pacification in the killing of the god or goddess. Whenever symptoms of mimetic contagion and violence recur, the original spontaneous killing is ritually enacted as sacrifice. But the deities are false deities. Sacrifices do serve a real purpose. They contain, in the double sense of the English word contain, the violence of that particular society. They restrain and limit it so that it cannot destroy the whole society, but only one member of it. But they also enclose this violence and channel it towards that member. Girard was convinced that Jewish and Christian scripture, in a long and complicated process, uncovered the truth of the victim, namely that societies stabilized themselves by projecting their medically induced violence and aggression on a common enemy, whom they deem guilty of all their ills, and then kill him or her in deference to a supposedly divine will. The biblical writings reveal that the persecuted victim is not a justly condemned culprit, but an innocent scapegoat. They eventually come to the conclusion that God sides with that victim and wants to protect the victim. While many biblical passages see this divine protection also as an act of violence, the high points of the biblical development depict God as non-violent, and his taking sides with the victim then consists in affirming the victim's innocence and finally in the restoration of the victim's life. This occurs in utmost clarity in the Hebrew Bible, with the character of the suffering servant in the second part of the book of Isaiah, and in the Christian New Testament with Jesus of Nazareth. Girard argues that the death of Jesus can be construed according to the scapegoat mechanism. Humans gang up and unite against an innocent victim, accuse him of grave crimes, and finally bring him to death. The New Testament, however, unambiguously depicts Jesus as innocent and in accordance with the divine will. His persecutors, on the other hand, as perpetrators of violence and trespassers of God's will. It reveals that Jesus, in fact, is a scapegoat, and thereby it destroys the scapegoat mechanism because, quote, the scapegoat cannot appear as scapegoat without losing all credibility. The concept of the scapegoat is a principle of illusion whose efficacy requires complete ignorance. To have a scapegoat is not to know that one has one. As soon as the scapegoat is revealed and named as such, it loses its power. So you really have to think the person is guilty, and then the mechanism works. Once you discover that this person is not guilty at all, but was selected for some kind of peculiarity, the wrong color of hair, the wrong color of skin, the wrong sex or whatever, and then you realize this is scapegoating, the effects that happened, they will not happen anymore. Thus, according to the early Girard, the gospel reveals that sacrifice is a human, not a divine institution, that is against God's will because it projects guilt and violence on an innocent victim. Furthermore, that there is a way to stabilize human society without resorting to sacrifice, namely by emulating the Christ and having one's mimetic desire directed by him. Thus, Girard sees a clear divide between myths and the Bible. The former hide the scapegoat mechanism, see God on the side of the persecutors, and view the victim as guilty. The latter sees God on the side of the victim, who is recognized as innocent, and thus unveils the scapegoat mechanism and renders it inefficacious. Girard also importantly notes that Christ was not divinized by those who killed him, but his divinity was recognized later by those who maintained his innocence. It is clear that in this context, the fact that the letter to the Hebrews, and in its way a strong strain of Christian tradition, interpreted Jesus' death as sacrificial, did not bode well with Girard. He therefore interpreted it as already belonging to what he called sacrificial Christianity, meaning a Christianity that misinterpreted its own founding event and therefore relapsed into the scapegoat mechanism and violence. The next quotation you'll find on your quotation sheet, part of it. Girard says, I believe it is possible to demonstrate that historical Christianity took on a persecutory character as a result of the sacrificial reading of the Passion and the Redemption. The very fact that the deity is reinfused with violence has consequences for the entire system, since it partially absolves mankind from a responsibility that ought to be equal and identical for all. Reducing the responsibility enables one to particularize the Christian event, to diminish its universality, and to search for the guilty men who would absolve humankind of guilt. The role the Jews fulfilled. So, for a long part of Christian tradition, the Jews were scapegoated with the death of Jesus, and Christianity viewed this death, Girard argues, in a wrong sacrificial way. So because of a misunderstanding of the crucifixion along the lines of archaic sacrifice, Christianity reinfused the image of God with violence, made the Jews the scapegoat for sins of all humankind, including Christians, and became violent to our religions. Girard considered the epistle to the Hebrews as the beginning of this development. Moreover, by its emphasis, the letter, by its emphasis on the positive value of suffering, Christianity, that's the it, developed a kind of masochistic tendency towards self-sacrifice that, according to Girard, has nothing to do with Christ's attitude in his passion, because his intention was not self-destruction at all. The Jesuit Raimund Schwager entered into a critical dialogue with Girard on this, and this dialogue was characterized by consent in general, but by clear disagreement on an important point. Schwager agreed with Girard on the nature of the scapegoat mechanism, the development of human cultures and archaic religions, the difference between myth and the biblical writings, the principal revelation and thus annihilation of the scapegoat mechanism. He even agreed that Christ's death should not be interpreted along the lines of archaic sacrifice, and that the history of Christianity displayed the violent traits that Girard had criticized as a result of a self-misunderstanding. Thus, Schwager and Girard agreed that this constituted what Lonergan would call a major inauthenticity in a strain of Christian tradition. Yet, Schwager defended the usage of the term sacrifice for the Passion, as well as the letter to the Hebrews and the Christian tradition that talked of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Schwager, in fact, argued that the term sacrifice could be used in two different senses. One archaic and being incompatible with a truly Christian view of the Passion, and one that had to be developed from that Passion in a genuine Christian interpretation of it. In March 1978, just after reading the original French of Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, an important book by Girard, Schwager argued that it was actually only the language in Hebrews that was sacrificial, but not the meaning. He claimed the continuity between the Old Testament and the letter to the Hebrews was not through sacrifice, but through faith. Jesus' sacrifice, he wrote, was that he had learned obedience. And this obedience was his faithfulness to the message of non-violence at the time of his greatest persecution. To be sure, Schwager works on two functional specialties here. When he talks about the interpretation of Hebrews, he works on the level of interpretation, where he talks about the meaning of sacrifice and in what sense Christ's death should be called a sacrifice. It is in the specialty of foundations, I would argue, for what is at stake here is not just the meaning of one concept or one sentence. On the understanding of the notion of sacrifice depends a whole horizon and its subsequent theological categories. What is at stake is the question of whether God is in any way complicit with violence, with the violence of the persecutors of Jesus and with violence in general, or whether God is completely on the side of the innocent victim, who by his non-violence reveals the very being of the Divine Father. Schwager is in complete agreement with Girard on that level, but he disagrees with him on the level of the interpretation of Hebrews. Now, one could argue that this disagreement was merely a nominal one. Whether one calls Christ's passion a sacrifice or not is merely terminologically relevant, but makes no systematic difference. This is correct insofar as any terminology could be different, as different languages use different linguistic means and still are more or less able to say the same things. But we know that it is not so easy. Languages and terminologies already structure our view of the world mediated by meaning, and therefore they might be more or less prone to biases and oversights. This becomes especially clear when we look at the outcome of the discussion between Schwager and Girard, where at the end, Girard basically changes his position in the following way. What he had said about archaic sacrifice, and what he had said about the passion being not a sacrifice in that sense, remained completely unchanged. And remember, these were the points where Schwager was in full agreement. However, Girard came around to distinguishing a Christian sacrifice from an archaic one. The later Girard used the term sacrifice of Christ in a positive sense, meaning the sacrifice in accordance with Christ's teaching about his heavenly Father, in agreement with the biblical writings, including Hebrews, and constituting a meaning of sacrifice that would be truly Christian, as opposed to Christian only in name, what Girard had called sacrificial Christianity. To be sure, speaking of a truly Christian sacrifice does not entail that this would have to be limited to Christianity. But it is genuinely Christian. If it is also in other religions, that's fine. That would even show that, as Lonergan said, religious conversion is not bound up to one particular religion. Now let us look at the result of Girard's development into realizing that the revised terminology makes some aspects visible that prior to that were harder to see, and he comes to making more explicit the interconnectedness of the two kinds of sacrifice. Girard made this very explicit in a piece first published in a Festschrift for Schwager's 60th birthday. Here again, I refer you to the quotation sheet. The use of the same word for both types of sacrifice suggests something essential, namely the paradoxical unity of religion in all its forms throughout human history. To recognize the positive sense of the term sacrifice when it encompasses the two extremes I have described is not necessarily to minimize the distance between these two extremes. On the contrary, one must be fully aware of the unfathomable gulf between these two extremes. The further the extremes are from each other, the more their union in a single word paradoxically hints at a going beyond the opposition between them. What the biblical account says is that one can renounce sacrifice in one sense, sacrifice of another, violence against another, only by assuming the risk of sacrifice in another sense, the sacrifice of Christ who died for all who were dear to him. Use of the same word in each case dispels the illusion of a neutral ground, where violence is nowhere to be seen, and this from a non-sacrificial vantage point that sages and scholars can permanently occupy in order to apprehend the truth at minimal cost to themselves. Girard is telling us here that the subject of the scholar never is a neutral subject. The subject of the scholar either is unconverted and thus complicit with archaic sacrifice, or he or she is converted and thus prepared to rather give their own life than take another's. Or, and that probably, I would say, is true for most of us, at least it's true for me, the subject of the scholar is somewhere in the middle. Converted enough to see this truth, but not enough to actually live it. And in that case, the danger exists that scholars think themselves to be above the fray on neutral ground, explicating the interwovenness of the two kinds of sacrifice precludes this illusion. In the following passages, Girard goes on to interpret God's role in the Passion and what the interdependence of the two kinds of sacrifice says about human religions. The divine reuse of the scapegoat mechanism completed the religious unity of mankind. It may perhaps be thought of as a slow and terrible voyage from the first sort of sacrifice toward the second, accessible to us only through Christ. Not the least of the reasons why this should be so is the fact that divine intervention is an exceedingly subtle phenomenon, without ever seeking to limit human freedom, and without ever allowing his revelation to become constraining or coercive. Christ guides humanity towards divine truth. Christ is not simply another sacralized scapegoat. Christ became a scapegoat in order to desacralize those who came before him and to prevent those who came after him from being sacralized. It follows from this that there are two radically opposed, yet formally similar modes of divinity. The archaic, which arises directly from the efficacy of scapegoats, and the Christian, which arises indirectly and paradoxically from their inefficacy by virtue of the destruction of false gods. As against the unjustly condemned scapegoats of all other religions, as Schwabe observes, there is the perfect scapegoat, both fully human and fully divine. As against imperfect sacrifices whose efficacy is temporary and limited, there is the perfect sacrifice that puts an end to all the others. End of this quotation. I come to the next section where I ask two kinds of sacralization. In the last quotation we heard, an interesting terminology is used. Girard speaks about sacralization and desacralization, and he obviously views the former as problematic, while he condones the latter. This might remind Lonergan scholars of Lonergan's more balanced and nuanced stance on sacralization and secularization, and even more of Robert Doran's account of it, as he developed that in explicit discussion with Girard's thought. For that reason, and because Doran also argues that Lonergan's article in fact was never properly finished, which he deems the reason why the article was not published during Lonergan's lifetime, I will mostly deal with Doran's text here, just a little bit also with Lonergan himself. At the beginning of his article, Doran already states the conclusions of his study. He distinguishes four different standards: sacralizations to be dropped and sacralizations to be fostered, secularizations to be welcomed, and secularizations to be resisted. I refer you again to the next sheet. Sacralization is to be dropped when it, he says, when it employs the name of God to justify persecution, exclusion, and scapegoat. It is to be fostered when it can be spoken of in Christian terms as adherence to what Lonergan calls the just and mysterious law of the cross, and entails the recognition, celebration of the transformation of evil into a greater good through the absorption of evil in love, an absorption that imitates the genuinely sacrificial attitude of the incarnate Word of God. Secularization is to be welcomed in the conduct and organization of human affairs, and now I add my words in what I would pretty much view as corresponding to what the Second Vatican Council called the legitimate autonomy of the world in Gaudium et Spes number 36. Secularizations to be resisted in the conduct and organization of human affairs are any grounded in a false secularization to condemn or scapegoat, and any consequent efforts to locate human coming of age as a human perfection to be attained exclusively in this life and exclusively on the basis of human resources. I completely concur with Doran that there is a great congruence between Girard and Lonergan on these matters. There still remains one terminological difference or problem. In Doran's conclusion, there is a sacralization to be fostered, while in Girard's parlance, sacralization is always a relapse into mythology, into the arcane. Can this discrepancy be overcome? And I have one other question, whose answer I hope will contribute to a solution for this problem. Is desacralization the same as secularization? Or is there something in between? Can something be desacralized but not be secularized at the same time? If so, this would open up also a revised language for the last time. One could resist secularization without fostering a sacralization. What is clear is that for Doran and for Lonergan, there is a distinction between the sacral and the really sacred, and the secular and the really profane. Still, it seems that for Doran and Lonergan, to rightly secularize is the same as to rightly desacralize. If you look back to Girard's revised view on Christian sacrifice, we encounter a different stance. Girard emphasizes that scapegoats need to be desacralized, and that this occurred by Christ voluntarily undergoing the scapegoat mechanism. But Girard does not apply the term sacred or sacralized to Christ, although he continues with a clear Christian profession of faith when he speaks of Christ's full humanity and full divinity. But through the Passion, he said, we recall, that there are, or he showed that there are two radically opposed yet formally similar modes of divinity, the archaic and the Christian. The one arises directly from the efficacy of scapegoats, the other indirectly by virtue of the destruction of false gods. The first of the two is sacral or sacred and needs to be desacralized. The latter, however, for Girard is divine, but it's not sacral or sacred. It should not be sacralized, but of course it is neither profane or secular. What should it be called? A possible solution I found again via Raimund Schwager, but it was my Innsbruck colleague Wolfgang Pallava who worked this out in greater detail. Schwager insisted in a letter to Girard that there is a radical distinction between the sacred, bracket violence, and holiness, and he wrote to Girard in French, so the translators give the original term that stood there, sainteté. Not sacredness, sacré, but sainteté. The holiness or saintliness of the Christian God. With that in mind, I would argue that desacralization and sacralization should not be identified. Desacralization can lead to secularization, and that is to be welcomed, I would agree with Lonergan and Doran, where this makes room for the autonomy of the earthly affairs of which the Second Vatican Council speaks. However, there would be no case where sacralization needs to be fostered. If the law of the cross corresponds to Girard's Christian notion of sacrifice, then in Lonergan's parlance, in Girard's parlance at least, It never fosters a sacralization. In the suggested terminology, it would foster a development into holiness or saintliness. The holy is not profane, and it is not secular, but it is free of all the trappings that go with the sacred as understood by Girard. The true God is not violent, does not demand sacrifice the way the archaic gods do. Awe should be rendered to God, but not anxiety. Wolfgang Palava explains, saintliness adheres to a kenotic concept of a non-violent God. Correspondingly, resisting a certain type of secularization need not lead to a re-sacralization. If we succeed in discovering the holy hidden in the sacred, the holy that becomes visible indirectly when we remove the sacred, we might be able to desacralize without secularizing. Lonergan formulated in his article, that's again on your sheet, if it was sacralization for Christ according to the flesh to be esteemed, revered, listened to, followed, so it was secularization for the secular power to condemn him to suffering and death. But it was a new and far superior sacralization for him to rise again according to the flesh, to sit at the right hand of the Father, to rule in a kingdom that has no end. And here, in my terminology that I would like to suggest, I would agree with Lonergan that many of the followers who esteemed, revered, listened to Jesus and followed him did, in a sense, sacralize him. But partly really in the problematic sense in which Girard talks about them. They sacralized him, which means they misunderstood him. And I would agree that the secular power tried to secularize him. Of course, this was also a misunderstanding. However, the second half of that quotation, when it comes to the resurrection and to the elements of the profession of faith thereafter, I would not call that a new sacralization. Instead, I would call that the discovery and acknowledgement of Christ's holiness. And I want to illustrate this by just shortly drawing your attention to two biblical passages in connection with the term the Christ or the Messiah. Now in Matthew chapter 16, we have Peter discover Christ being the Messiah, being hailed as the rock of the church and so on. And then Christ gives his first pronouncement of the way to the cross. And Peter refuses that, and he's chided very badly. You Satan, you go behind me. So I would say for Peter it was unthinkable, as for any Jews at that time actually, that the Messiah should die on a cross. But looking with Girard's eye on it, I would also say this was also because he had a sacralized view of who the Messiah was. He had to be a victor with power, maybe even with violence. So he could not suffer. He had to win. So this was this kind of sacralization and misunderstanding. And then the Gospel of Luke in chapter 24, when the disciples are on the way to Emmaus, they meet the risen Christ. And he tells them that the Christ had to suffer all this from the Hebrew writings. Now, in fact, I challenge my beginner students, my undergrads, to show me where this is in the Hebrew Bible, that the Messiah has to suffer. And the very good ones come up with the right idea, because of course it's nowhere literally in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible hardly speaks ever of the Messiah. But what of course is meant probably is the songs of the suffering servant. Christians identify this servant with the Christ and therefore developed a completely different notion of what it means to be the Christ. And I would say this notion now is desacralized. But it's not secular or profane. It is holy to show what the true holiness of the Christ is. The many problems Jesus had with misunderstandings among his own disciples, which also led to their abandoning him at the cross, can at least partly be explained that way. They viewed him as sacred in the sense Girard described, and only later did they discover that his holiness was of a different kind. The difference between the differentiations. Still, one could ask, why do we need this distinction between the sacred and the holy? Could one not argue in favor of using the same word with the same arguments that Schwabe used to argue for using the term sacrifice, both for the archaic and the Christian sacrifice? But why would Schwabe himself argue for using the same word in the case of sacrifice and for using different terms in the case of the sacred or the holy? My suggestion would be that the main reason might be that in the case of sacrifice, we are always confronted with human sinful action. Both the archaic and the Christian sacrifice occur in the situation of human violence. The situation in which the sacrifice of giving one's life is possible at all is brought about by sinful human action. If there were no human violence, there would never be the need for the sacrifice of life at all. In the case of the holy, it has to be said that, in the first place, God alone is truly holy. All saintliness, all human saintliness, being a reflection of this divine holiness. So, the holy is independent of human action. Only its reverberations have to do with human action. So the holy exists independently of human action. Human emulation of the holy comes later. This, I would argue, is emphasized by here choosing a different terminology. Still, here again it has to be underlined that the radical distinction cannot be a separation. Because here again, there is a radical continuity within the discontinuity, as in the question of sacrifice. I'm coming to my last point. Conversion as incomplete in statu viatoris. Having shown and illustrated the significance of religious conversion, I finally want to highlight the ongoing nature of conversion throughout one's life. Wandinger is well aware that conversion is not an instantaneous occurrence, that being another popular misconception. For many, the conversion of Saul into Paul supposedly happened in an instant when he fell off his horse on the way to Damascus. However, Acts chapter 9, which recalls his conversion, doesn't even mention a horse. But even Paul's conversion did not happen in an instant, as Acts tells us subsequently. He needed 3 days of prayers and fasting, and the help of another to come to terms with what had happened and to understand it. And admittedly, 3 days is a short time span, but it is much more than an instant. And maybe just a little aside just comes to my mind. Any of you might be music lovers. And there is this wonderful oratorio by Mendelssohn Bartholdy, Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, on Paul. And he has this scene where Paul is struck on the way to Damascus, and then a voice from heaven calls to him, "Why are you persecuting?" And when I first listened to that, and I was expecting somehow a thunderous bass maybe, or a harsh tenor, "Why are you persecuting me?" But what did Mendelssohn do? A Jewish convert to Protestant Christianity. He has a very thin, faint soprano ask, "Why are you persecuting me?" So it's just as if Mendelssohn has this theology of the subtleness of divine intervention into his music. I love it very much. Sorry for this digression. Wandinger explains, man's self-transcendence is ever precarious. Of itself, self-transcendence involves tension between the self as transcending and the self as transcended. So human authenticity is never some pure and serene and secure possession. It is ever a withdrawal from unauthenticity, And every successful withdrawal only brings to light the need for still further withdrawals. Genuine religion is discovered and realized by redemption from the many traps of religious adoration. So we are bid to watch and pray, to make our way in fear and trembling. And it is the greatest saints that proclaim themselves the greatest sinners, though their sins seem slight indeed to less holy folk that lack their discernment and their love. I take Lonergan's fine remark about the saints to imply that religious conversion in fact goes on throughout a person's life. We are never finished with it, and when we try to put basic special categories of theology into words, as I have done in this talk with sacrifice, naming one view a position and the other a counterposition, we are abstracting from the process. In fact, employing a model or an ideal type. This is legitimate, but only if we do not forget that this is an abstraction and keep in mind that human conversion is never complete, never pure, but dramatic in Schwager's term, or dialectical in Lonergan's part. It is thus shaped by both progress and decline, meaning that the partially converted can even slip back into being less converted, or sometimes may leap forward into being much more converted. Conversion is not a linear process, but one with leaps and bounds. If one forgets the dramatic element, one comes either to Girard's early stance on sacrifice, rejecting sacrifice in principle, because there is a notion of it that reveals a lack of religious conversion. Or one comes to a complete opposition between an archaic and a Christian view of sacrifice, the one being rejected and the other being condoned. Only when the dramatic character of the process is acknowledged can the two be recognized as moments in that drama, and can the similarity in the dissimilarity be seen as the later writings of Girard did. I would argue even more. I would argue that a lack of adverting to this element is itself a sign of an incomplete conversion. Thank you very much for your patience with me. And I'm looking forward to what my respondents will say to that, and then to, I hope, a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
So much better than I can. If you feel the need to stand up and stretch for a second, this is a good time for that. We are very fortunate this evening to compliment a distinguished lecturer with two very distinguished respondents. Joining us from St. Louis University is Professor Randall Rosenberg, Dean of the College of Arts and Letters and Associate Professor of Systematic Theology. Professor Rosenberg is an alumnus of our program here at Boston College. He's so interesting and well educated. He's the author of The Givenness of Desire, Concrete Subjectivity and the Natural Desire to See God, a project drawing on Aquinas, Lonergan, Girard, and others to explore the social and cultural mediation of the desire for God. He's also written a short book on John the 23rd, Good Pope John. It's not the title of the book, it's the title of the Pope. And he co-edited an important volume of essays by our esteemed colleague and teacher, Fred Lawrence. His articles have appeared in numerous North American and European journals, and he's working, as you'll hear, on a fascinating project on the theme of authenticity and spiritual exercise. We're also grateful to have recruited a third brilliant mind to complete our trifecta, Brian Robinette. Like our other speakers, Professor Robinette, our colleague here in the theology department, is a person of wide-ranging and fundamental interests. Last year I had the honor to do a co-taught seminar with him on the thought of Lonergan and Girard. And like, conversion is ongoing because it's never done with you. And reading those authors side by side makes you realize they're never done with you either. It's one of the great experiences of my life that I had the opportunity to try him. He's particularly interested in the theme of conversion and spiritual exercise, like our other speakers. His award-winning book, Grammars of Resurrection, appeared in 2009. Since then, a steady stream of articles has been announcing with increasing definition the contours of an eagerly anticipated second book, The Difference Nothing Makes, Creation, Christ, Contemplation, coming to shelves near you early next year. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jeremy. No thanks to you for the invitation, and to Mary, and Anne, and Fred, and Sue, and Pat, and everyone else. Thank you for the hospitality. Wonderful to be back here. And to Professor Wandinger, thank you for the stimulating paper. It's an honor to engage your work. I think I first heard you here in one of the summers when you did a tribute paper to Raymond Schweiger, so it's wonderful to be with you. I focus briefly my response tonight on two areas. One is the foundational role of the subject and the ongoing conversion of the subject in doing theology, one of the things you mentioned right at the beginning, and then of course at the end you talked about conversion being ongoing. So I want to briefly treat that. And then second, your suggestion to drop the sacral language toward the end of your paper, the provocative claim, and replace it with holiness or saintliness. So to the first and to the shorter version, or the shorter element of my response. I concur with Professor Wandinger's appreciation for Method's contribution of the role of the subject in theology. Method acknowledges the possible biases of the subject, and yet argues clearly that doing theology, and actually gaining knowledge in general, is impossible except for an authentic subject, even in the sciences, but clearly so in the humanities and in theology. And I'm quoting there Professor Wandinger. The older I get, the more stock I place in the importance of people who strive to be authentic, self-transcending subjects. In theology or in philosophy, but really in all areas of life. And when that's not going well, things aren't going well, you notice it more and more. So I'm grateful for this emphasis on authenticity and self-transcendence. And as Nikki points out at the end of his lecture, conversion is incomplete, ongoing in our pilgrim state. Even religious conversion goes on throughout one's life. And I think this is why I've gravitated in recent years in my recent work on making connections to Pierre Hadot's reading of philosophy as first a set of spiritual exercises, especially, and what I've been concentrating on lately is his treatment of Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, his big book, The Inner Citadel. Philosophy was first a set of spiritual exercises intended to bring about a transformation of the self in Hadot's reading. In such a vein, one might see how systematic theology, just for example, when severed from love-infused wisdom exercises, can be distorted into an arrogant or arid conceptualism. Thus, commitment to an ongoing set of spiritual exercises, to an ascesis that nurtures humility and wholeness, bears the possibilities for refining and reorienting the theological life as animated by a love of wisdom. The ongoing embrace of wisdom enables theologians to be attentive to the whole, intellect and affect, theory and praxis, contemplation and action, personal conversion and social transformation. Rowan Williams captures this sentiment well in his reflections on theology as a way of life. and I quote Williams, "The practice of theology as a way of life moves in and out of silence and in and out of intense self-scrutiny, not in order to produce an anxious perfectionism, but so as to rein in the confident, speculative spirit that will readily assume we can know God without changing our fundamental spiritual attitudes." Lonergan's holistic account of conversion that Nikki mentions at the beginning and explores religious conversion more deeply has much to contribute to this area. Lonergan's project can be framed, as Jeremy Wilkins notes in his recent book, and he's argued, as a program of practices, as a pedagogy of self-discovery for our development and practices as theologians. My second main point, a little longer, is the replacement of the term sacralization due to its archaic sacrificial language. I'm quite grateful to Professor Wandinger and his critique of Doran and Lonergan, or to point out its possible incompleteness in questioning whether those terms are adequate, especially the desacralization. And I quote him again to remind us of his words. "Desacralization can lead to secularization, and that is to be welcomed." Professor Wandinger says, "I would agree with Lonergan and Doran, where this makes room for the autonomy of earthly affairs of which the Second Vatican Council speaks in Gaudium et Spes 36. However, there would be no case where sacralization needs to be fostered. If the law of the cross corresponds to Girard's Christian notion of sacrifice, then it never fosters a sacralization in the sense of the authentic sacred. In the sense of the archaic sacred. In the suggested terminology, the law of the cross fosters a development into holiness or saintliness. The holy is not profane and it is not secular, but it is free of all the trappings that go with the sacred, as understood by Girard. The true God is not violent, does not demand sacrifice the way the archaic gods do. Awe should be rendered to God, but not anxiety." As one who's partly influenced by René Girard, I pride myself having the mimetic desire and scapegoating like radars up all the time, pointing it out all the time. Mimetic desire. But I must admit, I missed this one. And I've been reading that essay and revisiting that in my own work for some years, both Lonergan's essay and then Doran's extension of it. So I'm really grateful for you to kind of make me see it again in a new way. A Girardian encounters the phenomenon of sacralization the way a Lonergan person might spot a conceptualist or a naive realist from a mile away. Let them be anathema. I think I am persuaded by your suggestion, but maybe others can talk me out of it, but I found myself resonating with that, and I'll say why. I now see, the suggestion to replace the term, or at least, at the very least, to better see than I did before how easily one can conflate kind of the genuine sacred and the sacral in Girard's sense. So I engage and extend your suggestion here of holiness and saintliness over a sacralization to be welcome in an explicitly Trinitarian frame. How do we discern the presence of the Trinity in history? I've suggested in my own work, drawing on Doran's Trinity in history, that theologians might discern vestiges of Trinitarian love at work in a broken, interrupted, unfinished lives in our secular age. So concentrated in the past on the figure of Eddie Hillesum, a secular Dutch Jew, Holocaust victim, who actually Brian Robinette, you introduced me to probably about 10 years ago, her journals. There I focused on examples of religious experience with a focus on sanctifying grace and the habit of charity. But this evening, just for a little while longer, I want to take up an intriguing suggestion offered by Robert Doran in Volume 2 of Trinity in History, and where he revisits these themes of sacralization and secularization, but does so and offers another theological resource, or proposes that to us, and it has to do with actual grace. All right, so he offers a transposition of Aquinas' and Lonergan's respective accounts of actual grace as a way of discerning the presence of Trinitarian life wherever it may be found. And he emphasizes that it especially may be found in instances of resisting vengeance, of course, scapegoating, violence, of responding with love and transforming evil into a larger good, the law of the cross, as was mentioned in the lecture. Of course, the visible mission of the Word is the life of the incarnate Word, the one who was baptized and tested in the desert, the one who was crucified and raised to life. And Christ throughout his life was led by the mission of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the same Spirit that visited him at his baptism, led him into the desert, and also visited the apostles and other women and men in the upper room at Pentecost. But how might we think about the universal missions of the Word and Spirit, working invisibly, if you will? The invisible missions of the Word and Spirit throughout history, even beyond, of course, the ecclesial structures, explicitly ecclesial structures. How do we think about God not being confined by the familiar trappings of religiosity? That was one of the things Professor Wandinger wanted to point out, that there's a way in which the language of sacral confines. Actual grace, right, as an explanatory term, right, helps us offer such an explanatory account. I'm reminded of Marilyn Robinson's musing in her book of essays, "When I was a child, I read books." And I quote, "I experience religious dread whenever I find myself thinking that I know the limits of God's grace, since I am utterly certain it exceeds any imagination a human being might have of it. God does, after all, so love the world." In broad strokes, habitual grace and actual grace are correlative terms. Habitual grace has a certain relational permanence or stability, a being in love that gives us new powers of acting. Actual grace prepares us for habitual grace, but it also inwardly prompts us, assists us, nurtures us in the strengthening of the divine human relationship, which is needed if one conceives of conversion as an ongoing, lifelong process. It is the realm of prayer, the sacramental life, the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. Doran emphasizes that for Aquinas, actual grace can be both operative, God acts in us without us, and cooperative, God acts in us with us. This is especially important because of its implication for Nicky's emphasis on an anti-sacral account of religious conversion based in Lonergan and Doran, but also Girard and Schwager. To cite Nicky again, if the law of the cross corresponds to Girard's notion of Christian sacrifice, then it never fosters a sacralization in the sense of the archaic sacred. In the suggested terminology, the law of the cross fosters a development into holiness or saintliness. Doran focuses in his treatment not on Gaudium et Spes 36 in the second volume, but on Gaudium et Spes 22. So Gaudium et Spes, Second Vatican Council document, pastoral constitution on the church in the world, the church of the modern world. So Gaudium et Spes 22. And then also John Paul II's extension of some of those insights in his encyclicals. And the basic idea is that God's grace works in the hearts of all persons of goodwill in an unseen way. That the Holy Spirit, in a manner known, and I'm quoting the council, in a manner known only to God, offers to every person the possibility of being united with the paschal mystery, right? The law of the cross, in some ways. In Doran's reinterpretation, he says, what the tradition has called actual grace is at its core divinely given insights and acts of willing ends that elevate human beings to participation in divine life. To say it in a different way, actual grace consists of insights and radical shifts of horizon that are direct gifts of God in the course of concrete human historical experience. One of the theologians' responsibility in our age is to discern the presence of such participation in Trinitarian life wherever it may be found, and then to foster it and to use Doran's words to join hands with it in working for the establishing of God's reign in human affairs. Actual grace can also take the form of social grace. For Doran, and it's one of the things he argues in the book, in the creation of cultural values and the transformation of social structures. The discernment of social grace, of the presence of divine truth and love in cultural forms and social structures, is a key theological and pastoral challenge for our time. we need not think too hard about social conditions and cultural realities that perpetuate envy, violence, and scapegoating. But it is also important to discern what social structures and cultural realities protect us from such insidious habits of the heart and deleterious social practices. Perhaps to state it more succinctly, integration of Trinitarian theology provides specificity to Nikki's call to account for holiness or saintliness as a reflection on divine holiness, a reflection of divine holiness. Actual grace equips us with an explanatory way of discerning the invisible Trinitarian missions of word and spirit at work, even where we might not be expecting them. In other words, the challenge is to be attentive to 1, insights produced directly by God, wherever they occur, as instances of the invisible mission of the Word. And 2, acts of willing the end that are produced directly by God, wherever they occur, as instances of the invisible mission of the Holy Spirit. And 3, with Doran's emphasis, that everything we're expressing here about these insights and these acts of willing is built around the affirmation of the law of the cross as the key constituent in understanding what actual grace is. In other words, actual grace, these very insights and radical shifts of horizon that are direct gifts of God that occur in concrete human historical experiences, are instances of the genuine sacred, or, to drop that language, or in light of Nikki's warning, are instances of holiness or saintliness, no matter if they are found inside or outside the visible ecclesia. Such holiness is free of all trappings. These are the saints and the hidden saints and the primordial saints who have the insights and the authentic freedom to respond to evil not through vengeance or archaic sacrifice or scapegoating, but through Christian sacrifice, Christian love, as Girard eventually accepted through the prompting of Schweiger, as we learned tonight. And these moments of actual grace can happen in the midst of tense social situations, moments of grave injustice, but also in the quotidian, the family, the faculty senate, a soccer team, or the parents on a soccer team, and even in an academic department at a university. I thank Professor Wandinger once again, and I hope I've contributed in some way to the conversation.
Good evening. Randy, you had me all the way up until you said faculty senate. So we'll talk about that later. Thank you, Jeremy, for the introductions and for the invitation. And thank you all for being here. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude for sharing this panel with my 2 esteemed colleagues. And it seems like the last time I saw each of them was on a panel, academic panel. This is how we tend to connect, I guess. It's a weird thing about academic life. I really want to especially thank Professor Wandinger for orchestrating this very dynamic encounter between Bernard Lonergan, René Girard, and Raymond Schwager. That he managed to offer his own set of proposals with such intelligence and clarity is a significant contribution. And I'm basically convinced by your overall lines of argument and then the aims of dramatic theology I'm a supporter. And I'm benefited by having a better grip on distinguishing forms of the sacred and the secular in the manner that you presented, and we'll be thinking about that for quite some time. Of course, the implications of these distinctions comprise an ongoing task for theological work, but we figure to make greater headway in that work when equipped and with the distinctions charted here. So I come at this material with a long-standing interest in Girard's work. And I've also drawn upon Schwager's work in order to develop Girard's ideas in more systematic ways. My engagement with Lonergan is a bit more recent, perhaps an inevitable feature of being here at Boston College. but I have benefited enormously from this engagement, and not least from the vibrant community associated with it, as evidenced here. There is a rich history of engagement between Monaghan and Girard at Boston College. And I like to imagine that the seminar that we did last year has initiated maybe a new chapter in that history. And if I can make a sales pitch in passing, I would like to suggest to those here to explore further this connection and consider contributing to what might be called Monaghan-Girard 2.0, or is it 3.0? I don't know, but you get the idea. In the effort to make a modest contribution to this conversation, I'd like to reflect further on a key distinction developed by Professor Wandinger. Namely, and of course this is a line from a quoted text by Girard, two radically opposed yet formally similar modes of divinity. Here he is referring to the opposition between the archaic mode of divinity, whose aura is generated through the efficacy of sacrificial violence, and a Christian mode of divinity, which is made known to us through the revelation of God's non-violent, self-giving love in Christ. The difference between these two modes of divinity is not one of degree, but kind, although they need to be related in the way that has been proposed. But the difference between them is so great that we might be excused for thinking of Christian faith as a kind of atheism by comparison. And this is a point that Girard would sometimes make. We use this language somewhat hyperbolically, I suppose. It is not insignificant to note that when Girard's thesis on scapegoating violence first appeared in 1972, it caused a stir in France and beyond, because it seemed to a number of its readers, approvingly, to expose the violent origins of archaic religions, and presumably all religions, with unprecedented focus and explanatory range. One favorable review, appearing in Le Monde, heralded it as, quote, the first authentically atheistic theory of religion and the sacred. Such reception was not entirely wrong to situate Girard and company with the likes of Marx and Freud and Nietzsche, those whom Paul Ricoeur dubbed the masters of suspicion. It's a great band name, by the way, too. In fact, Girard's mimetic theory represents a deconstructive hermeneutic of suspicion, in the sense that it means to expose the mechanisms of sacrificial violence, to dispel its mystery, so to speak, and assist us in withdrawing our participation in it. Mimetic theory can be understood as an effect and instrument of disenchantment, if by enchantment we mean the sacred order that exclusionary violence generates. The aura of collective transcendence and in-group unanimity at the expense of a victim or an outsider, some other. That is subject to demythologization when it becomes the object of research and analysis, and to this extent, Girard saw his work in continuity with the secularizing forces underway in those cultures where awareness of scapegoating and its effects grows. This is correlated to the positive meaning of secularity for Girard, as Wandinger has helped to make clear. What some of those initially enthusiastic of Girard's work miss, however, and one of the reasons why his work remains so controversial in the academy today, is that Girard never imagined that he had unearthed disturbing secrets of human culture through an ingenious theory of his own devising, but rather that the deceptive dynamics of scapegoating were decisively laid bare by the scriptural traditions of Judaism and Christianity. What makes the process of scapegoating more visible to us today than ever before, such that it could even become an object of investigation, is the influence of those cultures impacted by the biblical traditions, and the way those traditions expose, demystify, and destabilize sacral structures over time. So any theorization concerning the mechanism of scapegoating, but more generally, and this is very important to hear, any critical stance that gives privileged place to victims of social systems is indebted to the remarkable sea change that has occurred and is still occurring as a result of the biblical traditions that take the perspective of the victim as its organizing hermeneutic. This is true even when the Bible is summarily dismissed as mythical or ethnocentric, as is common among secular humanists and even some Christians today. It is by these traditions that we have become sensitized to the expelled other in an unprecedented way. Though by no means subscribing to a naive view of historical progress, Girard insists that our society, and this is a quote, is the most preoccupied with victims of any that ever was. No historical period, no society we know, has ever spoken of victims as we do. We are all actors as well as witnesses in a great anthropological first. That is from his text, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning. Indeed, the status of the victim carries so much moral and political currency today that, notwithstanding the fact that there really are victims of injustice, virtually any person or group can lay claim to victimhood in order to wield power. Ironically, the perceived power of being victim can become a matter of mimetic rivalry, such that various persons or groups or political parties and even entire nations can make regular appeals to being the other's victim in order to gain competitive leverage over the other. This would, I think, constitute a form of resacralization of victim in the language that has been used today. Now, I'm going to return to this peculiar problem in a minute, but I would like to first linger over what this implies about our understanding of atonement in the Christian tradition. This is a massively vexed issue, since there are those who, for understandable reasons, wish to reject atonement theories altogether, as they seem to implicate God in violence. That there had to be a victim, that some kind of atonement had to take place in order to restore our relationship with God and each other, that a violent death was instrumental to God's purposes in any way. All of this suggests that God is somehow party to sacrificial violence, and therefore involved in the very injustice of scapegoating from which we are supposed to be freed. Should we wish to articulate a compelling vision of salvation, Christianly speaking, so this critique goes, we should sideline the biblical images and subsequent theological traditions that underwrite sacrificial atonement, and opt instead for accounts that highlight God's will for human liberation. We should speak of the cross primarily in terms of solidarity with victims, for example, and avoid the suggestion that God makes victims, or allows victims, or perhaps wishes us to become victims as an index of holiness. Such a critique needs deep and continual hearing. For there is no doubt that distortive and oppressive accounts of the cross are found in Christian history, including today, along with their harmful pastoral and political implications. It thus becomes an important task for theology to trace, and to the extent possible, correct. This is part of theology's critical function. But difficult questions immediately arise. However justified this intention. For example, how do we pursue this critical function while also attending to the fuller range of images, metaphors, and narrative patterns in the biblical traditions, including the bits that offend us or simply confound our current sensibilities? By what criteria do we make judgments about subsequent theological traditions? Is there a risk that we become willfully selective in how we engage Scripture and tradition? What do we really owe classic texts and communal memories that we feel need correction or supplementation in some way? Granted that there will always be some kind of selective process in such engagements, how do we avoid setting up a canon within the canon, so to speak, or pursue theological agendas that reflect the presentism of contemporary sensibilities? In short, must we jettison, get rid of theories of atonement? These were the kind of questions that first drew me to Girard over 2 decades ago. Never before had I encountered a thinker whose work focused so squarely on the problem of violence in the Bible. And never since have I found a thinker who has helped me better understand how the cross reveals the nonviolent, self-giving love of God. For although he was not trained as a theologian, and often demurred at the suggestion that he was a theologian, and this is one of the reasons why the dialogue with Schwager helped him so much, Girard's insights into the dynamics of human conflict and our congenital tendency to produce victims in order to contain our conflict has provided an anthropological basis for understanding the salvific import of the cross, unlike any other thinker I know. And I'm going to quote Girard, and this comes from one of the texts that was already quoted. Christ became a scapegoat to desacralize those who came before him and to prevent those who come after him from being sacralized. End quote. In this densely packed formulation, we can see how, on the one hand, Girard's stark rejection of sacralization is fully in line with those who might wish to reject atonement theologies for fear that they implicate God in violence, or somehow valorize the status of being victim, as though this were in itself a matter of holiness or social utility. The early Girard's anti-sacrificial reading of the Gospels represents a hermeneutic of suspicion at its most searing, for it basically declares that such a God doesn't exist, that such divinity, so-called, is merely the projective fantasy of human beings who generate a false canopy of transcendence through a powerful, if ultimately delusory, sense of awe and dread, always at the expense of some expelled other. Given our susceptibility to runaway conflict, and given our tendency to establish some kind of personal or collective identity in the face of chaos and mortality, we constantly fall into the trap of reifying some other as the boundary by which I, or we, or us can be defined. Such are the personal and social dynamics of scapegoating, no matter what form or scale they take. But then, how could we ever be freed from such a trap? If it really is the case that our species exhibits this tendency to such a degree that we might call it the oldest play in the book, original sin might be a good term for it, then how could we ever become conscious of it, or see through its sham justice, or be led out of its gravitational pull? This is made all the more challenging because scapegoating appears to work. It really does seem to provide a certain kind of order, or identity, or peace, put these in scare quotes, albeit temporarily and unjustly. So, how could we be purged of this deep cultural habit and come increasingly to see what it is that we are caught up in? Girard's response, it turns out, is both ancient and new. For although he did not develop his response as a professional theologian, and there's something refreshing about that, I must confess, he perceptively reads the gospel traditions to see that the characteristic pattern of divine action is one of subversion from within. You're talking about something slow. This is why I want to explicate. This is the sense of atonement that Girard vigorously affirms. It is not a juridical sense, much less penal substitution, but what Gustave Alain refers to as the Christus Victor approach, which was widely developed in the patristic era, especially Irenaeus of Lyon, Athanasius, and Gregory of Nyssa, to name just a few. On this view, a brief summary, needing much unpacking, but let me do my best in a paragraph. God does not overcome the principalities and powers with a greater, more impressive form of violence, as this would only make God reciprocal to our violence, and essentially retributive. Rather, God lovingly enters into the fray of our human situation and inhabits the place of human infirmity, becoming identified with the poor, the naked, the ousted, the slave, in a word, the scapegoat. God's redemptive love goes to the heart of our dysfunction, infiltrates its secret recesses in order to expose and release its clutches from within. It reaches into those places where we are most vulnerable to rivalry, condemnation, alienation, shame, and the ravages of party spirit, even becoming victim to them, not in order to give them divine sanction, but to unbind and transmute them with love's releasing power. The kenotic love of God in Christ may seem like the absence of power from one point of view, and yet it is its radical incidence. It is true power, holiness, a persuasive rather than coercive power that enters freely and concretely into our human situation in order to transform what epitomizes our human brokenness, as exemplified in the cross, into the means of new life or resurrection. God thereby absorbs, using this is Lonergan's language, absorbs the scapegoat mechanism, not in order to valorize it, but so that it might be exposed and its arthritic grip released. It is in this sense that we rightly refer to such love as sacrificial, and its ultimate purpose is to educate human beings into a way of belonging rooted in reconciliation and communion, rather than mimetic rivalry and exclusionary othering. And this last part is key. For inasmuch as the cross and resurrection reveals something decisive about who God really is, it simultaneously is the opening up of a way of our being together in discipleship and revealing who we really are, or who we ought to become. Through its ritual and sacramental practices, preaching and teaching, fellowship, institutional forms, ethical norms, etc., Christian community is meant to rehearse patterns of life marked by justice, forgiveness, and peace, and thus offer a way of relearning mimetic desire together. In this way, the church, or ecclesia, can be a leaven for the world, a school of conversion. That Raymond Schwager helped Girard to give a full-throated theological account of this dramatic approach to atonement is a testament to what interdisciplinary work and friendship might yield. Again, I dare say that what the two of them have provided constitutes an indispensable achievement for Christian theology for our time. And it is worth studying and working through its implications for a broad range of functional specialties, ranging from interpretation and foundations to doctrines and communications. And since I have just alluded to Lonergan here at the conclusion of my remarks, allow me to finish by saying just how convergent this account of redemption is with Lonergan's law of the cross, which articulates the view of God's transformation of evil into good. As Lonergan puts it in The Redemption, the cross reveals how evil is patiently absorbed by a more difficult good. It's a gorgeous line. Patiently absorbed by a more difficult good. It is not a conquering justice, as with judges and military leaders, but a victory that comes by way, as he puts it, superabundance. Little wonder, then, that there is already an established literature that brings Girard and Lonergan into dialogue on this vital point, including from my two esteemed colleagues on this panel. It is my hope that this gathering today advances this dialogue further and inspires others to do the same. Thus concludes the longer form of my sales pitch.
We'll spend a few more minutes and take a few questions. It's like drinking from a fire hose.
So I'm sure that everybody is